Across the United States, a growing national conversation is taking shape around a question many people once believed was settled forever. Can U.S. citizenship ever be taken away? This question has gained renewed attention following the introduction of a proposed piece of legislation in Congress known as the Fraud Accountability Act. For millions of naturalized citizens, immigrants, and families with immigration ties, headlines and social media posts about this bill have sparked anxiety, confusion, and uncertainty. Some have gone as far as suggesting that citizenship is no longer permanent or that long-standing protections are suddenly at risk. This video is not about fueling fear or speculation. Its purpose is clarity. We are here to explain exactly what this proposal says, what it does not say, who it could potentially affect, and, most importantly, why constitutional protections around U.S. citizenship remain strong. To understand the significance of the Fraud Accountability Act, it is essential to first understand what denaturalization means under current U.S. law. Denaturalization is not a new concept, nor is it commonly used. Historically, it has been applied in extremely limited circumstances. Under existing law, denaturalization is generally possible only when U.S. citizenship was obtained unlawfully in the first place. This includes situations where an individual committed fraud or made material misrepresentations during the naturalization process itself, such as hiding serious criminal history, providing false information on applications, or concealing facts that would have made them ineligible for citizenship at the time it was granted. In other words, denaturalization has traditionally functioned as a corrective mechanism, not a punishment. It exists to address cases where citizenship should never have been granted because the legal requirements were not truly met. Once citizenship is lawfully obtained, it is intended to be permanent. Crimes committed after naturalization are handled through the criminal justice system, not through immigration enforcement. A core principle of U.S. law is that citizenship, once granted in accordance with the law, is secure. This distinction between immigration law and criminal law has long been foundational. Citizenship is not meant to be conditional, temporary, or subject to revocation based on future conduct. That principle is what makes the Fraud Accountability Act controversial and widely debated. The Fraud Accountability Act is a proposed bill introduced in both the U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives. It was developed in response to several large-scale fraud cases that drew national attention and raised concerns about accountability. On its surface, the bill focuses on strengthening penalties for fraud-related offenses. However, embedded within its language are provisions that would significantly alter how immigration consequences, specifically denaturalization, are applied. It is important to stress that this bill is not law. It is currently in the legislative process, meaning it is under discussion, review, and debate. No changes are being enforced, and no existing citizenship protections have been altered. The most significant and controversial element of the Fraud Accountability Act is its proposal to expand denaturalization beyond fraud committed during the naturalization process. Under this proposal, certain fraud offenses committed after an individual becomes a U.S. citizen could trigger denaturalization. This represents a major shift in legal philosophy. Instead of denaturalization being used to correct an unlawful grant of citizenship, it would be used as a punishment for later behavior. This would move citizenship law into new territory, where post-naturalization conduct could directly affect citizenship status. For naturalized citizens, this raises serious legal and constitutional concerns because native-born citizens would never face comparable consequences for the same conduct. Another major change proposed by the bill involves procedure. Currently, denaturalization cases are handled through a separate civil court process. This process exists independently from criminal proceedings and includes its own evidentiary standards, review mechanisms, and opportunities for defense. The Fraud Accountability Act would eliminate that separation. Under the proposed framework, criminal courts handling fraud convictions would also be required to address denaturalization within the same case. This means there would be no separate civil review focused solely on citizenship status. Denaturalization would become an automatic consequence following certain convictions rather than a carefully examined legal determination. The language used in the bill is particularly important. The proposal states that judges shall order denaturalization upon qualifying fraud convictions. This mandatory wording removes judicial discretion entirely. Judges would have no authority to consider individual circumstances, length of citizenship, family ties, rehabilitation, or proportionality. Denaturalization would no longer be case specific. It would be automatic. This represents a sharp departure from traditional principles of due process, fairness, and individualized justice that are central to the American legal system. The bill also removes the existing $10,000 fraud threshold. Under current law, certain immigration consequences are triggered only when fraud offenses meet a specific monetary level. The Fraud Accountability Act eliminates that requirement. Under the proposal, any qualifying fraud conviction, regardless of dollar amount, could potentially trigger severe consequences. Critics argue that this dramatically broadens the scope of affected conduct and risks, capturing minor, nonviolent, or relatively low-level offenses. While the impact would differ for permanent residents and naturalized citizens, both groups could face harsher outcomes under this expanded framework. Legally, the bill proposes amendments to Section 237A2 of the Immigration and Nationality Act. Traditionally, this section defines deportable offenses for non-citizens, including lawful permanent residents. These provisions have never applied to U.S. citizens. The proposed changes would extend similar logic to naturalized citizens through denaturalization mechanisms. This is legally unprecedented. Applying deportability concepts to citizens challenges long-standing legal distinctions that have existed for decades and raises fundamental questions about the nature of citizenship under federal law. One of the most controversial provisions in the Fraud Accountability Act is its retroactive reach. The proposal would apply to qualifying fraud convictions dating back to September 30th, 1996, nearly 3 decades ago. This means conduct that was already resolved under previous legal standards could be re-examined under new rules. Retroactive punishment is generally disfavored in U.S. law and raises serious constitutional concerns. For long-term citizens who have built families, careers, and stable lives, this provision introduces uncertainty that many legal experts find deeply troubling. Despite the attention this bill has received, it is critical to understand how the legislative process works. Introducing a bill does not make it law. Every year, thousands of proposals are introduced in Congress, and only a small percentage are ever enacted. Bills must pass committee review, survive debate and amendments, pass both chambers of Congress, and receive presidential approval. Many bills function as political signaling rather than realistic legislative outcomes. At this stage, the Fraud Accountability Act remains a proposal under discussion. There is no immediate change to citizenship law, and panic is not warranted. Even if such a bill were to pass Congress, it would face enormous constitutional obstacles. One of the strongest protections for U.S. citizenship comes from the Supreme Court case Afroyim versus Rusk. In that landmark decision, the court ruled that Congress cannot revoke U.S. citizenship involuntarily once it has been lawfully granted. Citizenship was affirmed as a constitutional right, not a conditional privilege. This precedent directly conflicts with the bill's attempt to mandate denaturalization as punishment for post-naturalization conduct. Legal experts widely agree that any such law would face immediate constitutional challenges. Another critical Supreme Court case is Schneider versus Rusk, which established that naturalized citizens cannot be treated as second-class citizens. The Constitution guarantees equal protection regardless of how citizenship was obtained. Critics of the Fraud Accountability Act argue that it effectively creates two classes of Americans: native-born citizens with permanent, unconditional protection, and naturalized citizens whose status could be revoked. This distinction runs counter to decades of constitutional law and makes the bill legally fragile. Beyond legal theory, there are real-world concerns. The definition of fraud is broad, and enforcement could vary significantly across states and courts. This raises the risk of uneven application and disproportionate punishment. For millions of naturalized citizens, even the uncertainty surrounding such proposals can create fear, hesitation, and mistrust. Immigration law has traditionally attempted to balance enforcement with fairness. Critics argue that this bill disrupts that balance by removing proportionality and discretion. Historically, denaturalization exists to correct fraud in the citizenship process itself, not to punish future behavior. Using citizenship law as a criminal penalty blurs the line between criminal justice and immigration enforcement. Two systems courts have long tried to keep separate. Legal analysts warn that normalizing this approach could expand government power over identity and set dangerous precedents for the future. Despite dramatic headlines, the likelihood of this bill becoming enforceable law remains uncertain at best. Constitutional challenges, Supreme Court precedent, and political resistance all stand in its way. Even if passed, courts could block enforcement. This is why legal professionals emphasize informed awareness rather than fear. Understanding the proposal is important, but so is recognizing the checks and balances built into the U.S. legal system. The most important message right now is simple. This bill is not law. Existing constitutional protections for naturalized citizens remain fully intact. Criminal convictions already carry consequences, but citizenship itself remains strongly protected. Staying informed through verified, fact-based sources is far more productive than reacting to social media panic. The Fraud Accountability Act proposes an unprecedented expansion of denaturalization powers, but it faces serious legal and constitutional hurdles. Supreme Court precedent, equal protection principles, and procedural safeguards all stand in its way. At present, it remains a proposal, not enforceable law. Bold headlines do not override constitutional protections. Understanding the difference between proposed legislation and actual law is essential for confident, informed decision-making. At Alex Morgan, our mission is to explain complex immigration and citizenship issues clearly, calmly, and accurately. We focus on facts, not fear. As legislation evolves, we will continue providing updates, legal analysis, and practical insights so viewers can stay informed without unnecessary anxiety. This video is for general informational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. Laws can change and outcomes vary based on individual circumstances. Always verify information through official government sources or qualified legal professionals. Most importantly, remember that constitutional protections for U.S. citizenship remain strong. Awareness, not fear, is the goal.